So good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are joining from, to this webinar on sustainable and healthy living environments, how to mobilize citizens' knowledge. And my name is Taru Peltola. I'm from the Finnish Environment Institute, Syke, and I have the pleasure to lead the project that is organizing this webinar. The project is called Public Science for Sustainable Living Environments, and the aim of this project is to explore and experiment with and also assess citizen science. And we are focusing on particularly on two themes, on food environments and local waters, and our specific mission is also to seek ways to engage young people who often are not the primary group to be involved in many participatory processes. And today we have invited three keynotes from very inspirational scholars we've been following. So I really very much look forward to the talks. Uta Wehn will kick off by outlining the policy relevance and policy impacts of citizen science, and then Chris Reynolds will tell about experiences from UK food policy context, and then finally Abby King will focus on community engagement and empowering methodologies. And we've also invited three commentators, Sanna-Riikka Saarela and Anna Salminen and Minna Kaljonen will give their commentaries after the keynotes, after each keynote, to spark off the discussion. So I wish you all a very fruitful webinar with this program, and I will hand now over to colleague Maria Ojanen, who is moderating the keynote session.
Yeah, hi, also warmly welcome on my behalf. I'm Maria Ojanen, researcher from the Finnish Environment Institute. So each presentation is approximately 20 minutes, after which we have the commentary note and time for questions and comments. Feel free to already, if you have ideas, to put them in the chat as well. And so the webinar is recorded, so if you don't want to be seen, then you can just switch off your camera. Yeah, so Uta, if you're ready, then please go ahead and start.
Right. Hi everyone, it's really nice to be here. Let me just confirm that you can see my screen. I'm a social science
we can see it.
From the field of science, technology, innovation studies. I've been working on the theory and practice of citizen science for some 10 years now, mostly related to water and environment, and more recently also related to the ocean on marine citizen science. And I'm very happy to be here and share with you today some reflections on how we might reimagine the science policy interface now that we can put citizen science into the equation of what really is the policy relevance and the policy impact of citizen science. To start off with, it may be good just to touch base what we mean by citizen science, and it's often used as a container term that actually covers a whole range of other terminologies with which it has a lot in common. So overall, there is absolutely no shortage in terminology, how different fields and disciplines think about citizen science. There's many ways we can cut this cake. But it's really the overarching term of citizen science that we speak about today, and which captures the notion of the key role of citizens, members of the public, having a role in data and knowledge creation, and sometimes even the application. And of course, there's different ways, different dynamics at play in different citizen science projects. Open science is an important parallel movement that is now very prominent with the UNESCO recommendation on open science, and it puts emphasis not only on providing open access to the results of research and open data, but also the open engagement of societal actors. So citizen science is really one way of opening production of scientific knowledge. So if we look at citizen science from a science-driven perspective, it's important to highlight that citizen science is not just about data collection. It's really a way of opening up the scientific method and potentially allowing citizens into any step of the scientific process, be it even framing the research question, understanding results, or taking action. And one way in which a little bit of order has been created, if you like, in the field of science-driven citizen science, we can distinguish contributory projects where citizens are primarily invited to help collect data or analyze data, collaborative projects where the process is already opening up a little bit, and the research question, the project design is being discussed. And also the outreach is an activity that's done jointly. And then there are those projects that we might call co-created, where really the entire steps in the scientific methods are done jointly by scientists and citizens. But we are, of course, very much interested in this relationship between science and policy then. And we can draw on the nice illustration analysis that the colleagues at the Joint Research Centre in ISPRA have done to really start unpacking this relationship between citizen science and policy. So in the grey shaded steps of the policy cycle, you might recognize what we perhaps immediately think of. It's really gathering data in order to shape policy, in order to devise policy, in order to put an item on the policy agenda. But actually the role of citizen science doesn't stop there, because once policies have been adopted and are being rolled out, there is a role for citizen science also to monitor the performance of that policy and seeing to what extent there are actually visible and observable changes in the physical environment, for example, but also the extent to which there is compliance with a specific policy. And this relationship of citizen science and policy has also been mapped in terms of, well, which specific thematic areas do we see a strong relationship? And again, due to work commissioned by the Joint Research Centre, we know that biodiversity, nature and landscapes is a very prominent theme, where there's a very explicit link and relationship and direction towards policy, followed closely by air quality and water, and of course many other topical areas. So to make this slightly more concrete, in the MIX project, measuring the impacts of citizen science, where we have a number of case studies throughout Europe, we're actually using citizen science in two ways. On the one hand, we're using citizen science to make the case, to set policy, to say, help us implement nature-based solutions, gathering evidence that the nature-based solution is needed. This is, for example, the case in the Hungarian case study, Krikrakos near Budapest. In fact, I was there yesterday getting burned as we were looking at the concrete structures into which the current creek is being forced. And now the work of the citizen scientists is trying to gather evidence on water quality, habitat, etc., to make the case to local authorities to restore a natural creek flow. But also in the other case studies, for example, in Italy and Romania, wetlands have previously been implemented, and the citizen science work is very important to show how water quality improves as it actually flows through the wetlands, and also to make sure that these wetlands are maintained and that is really clear how important they are for the natural habitat in those areas. So as we start really saying then what is going on with this science policy interface, as we put citizen science into the equation, we might simplify this and say, well, what is the science policy interface about in the first place? So very simplistically put, of course, we have the scientific community producing scientific knowledge, we have policymakers ideally acting upon that knowledge, but it's not a one-way linear relationship. It's often a very fruitful relationship in which policymakers also clearly give signals to the scientific community about data knowledge gaps, and science can then be produced in order to substantiate policy decisions. Let me now factor in citizen science and communities, community-based efforts. On the one hand, we have that often bilateral relationship between citizens and scientists in various forms of citizen science, which we see partly overlaps with the science policy interface. But we also have a strong relationship, and this is also a known interface, of participatory environmental governance, of the engagement of the public in consultation and decision-making processes. And where we really see now where we can reimagine the science policy interface is this sweet spot where all three previous interfaces, let's say, overlap, and where we really use the best of all three to come together and to open up not just the scientific process, but also this dialogue between science and policy, and the many aspects that public participation in policymaking has to offer. That sounds great, but on the other hand, we already know that mobilizing knowledge, scientific knowledge, let alone knowledge coming from citizen science and communities, is not always easy, because we have ongoing debates of what counts as evidence in decision making, and how does that evidence count, and who actually decides how that evidence counts. And you might say, well, citizen science puts, the initial question really primarily on top, is to say, who actually decides what gets measured before we have any data on the table in order to make decisions on various aspects to water and the environment and other issues. So our life is not getting easier, but luckily, of course, we have existing scientific experience in the social sciences, for example, we can draw on to help us understand what is going on in the decision-making process. What we have done here is we have used the so-called democracy cube that was developed in the early 2000s by Fung, and we have factored in citizen science here. So in terms of who's actually part of a decision-making process, citizen scientists come in. How they participate in the process. On the one hand, what's new, of course, is either the implicit or explicit data collection, but of course they can also, they're not limited to just the provision of data. They can share knowledge, they can argue, make the case for specific decisions. And the vertical impact axis then actually shows, well, what role does any of these stakeholders have? Do they have any formal direct authority in the decision-making process, or are they mere observers in the process for their own education and benefit, but no direct authority on the final decision? So it really highlights that when we are doing citizen science, ideally we should realize that this is a multi-stakeholder phenomenon. Certainly, when we're striving to exert policy change and trying to produce policy-relevant citizen science. So we have to realize that citizen science is not just about the citizens and their heterogeneous motivations and incentives, which often differ across different groups within local communities even. We also have the scientists and what we might call the data aggregated community. And of course, we have decision makers and policy makers, all of whom have their respective incentives, but also barriers on the extent to which they can really embrace new forms of participation and the role of citizen community knowledge in their decision making. So how that actually then pans out is a question of context and stakeholder dynamics. Here we try to unpack then what are different participatory forms of environmental governance that we see emerging, and how can we use this understanding to help different citizen science communities actually shape the form of participatory environmental governance that they might want. And so just to briefly illustrate, is on the one hand, in some cases, the ambition is to absorb the implicit and explicit data produced by citizens And that's as far as the stakeholders jointly want to go. In others, where they're more open towards cooperative planning, they go beyond the mere monitoring and actually open up processes for stakeholder consultation and engagement, feedback and discussion. So it's a more bilateral dialogue emerging. And then we have those forms of participatory environmental governance that we might say are real environmental stewardship, and we see a fully realized dialogue and responsibility, shared responsibility for natural resource management. In practice, we have done this, for example, in the Ground Truth project that ran till the end of 2019, which was entirely dedicated to producing and validating a co-design methodology so that we can do demand-driven citizen science that has a direct link into policy and can inform and influence policy and local decisions. Demand-driven in the sense that we did this in 6 countries with distinctly different socioeconomic, political, geographical conditions in Europe and in Africa. The topics were demand-driven, bottom-up by the communities we were working with, ranging from the impacts of climate change, air quality, water levels, water quality, for example, working at very different scales, but we had one consistent approach to help them co-design their initiatives. And if we go back to mapping them where they ended up, let's say in the participatory governance scheme, we can see that there's quite a diverse choices being made by the respective stakeholders and the observatories that they have created. Co-design methodologies are very important, and there's increasing insight in the community of citizen science practitioners. I think it's also important to really frame this whole discussion within the context of social learning, which sometimes is simplified to saying, oh, well, it's collective learning rather than people learning individually. Yes, it is, but not only. And I think the most important part of the definition I'm sharing with you here is that the property of the process is such that it actually transforms the situation. And in the context of the science policy interface and embracing citizen science in that interface, it's really a matter of evolving the governance system and different stakeholders learning how to deal not only with this new data stream, but with these new forms of stakeholder relationships and interactions that it can provide. So, to conclude, what we see really is, as we are reimagining the science policy interface, I think what's really required is that all the actors also reimagine their roles, and that business as usual is not going to cut it. There are comfort zones that people will have to move out of. I think it's also increasingly clear that not all forms of citizen science will have this either natural, automatic, or easy link into policy and decision making. Some will go perhaps more the traditional route of really strengthening science primarily, and then influencing policies through the more traditional science policy interface. It's also really important to point out the different timing we're talking about. Citizen science initiatives usually benefit from a lot of momentum, collecting data, for example, in different seasons, keeping people engaged and busy over a year or so, whereas the policy cycle often has a much longer timeline, and trying to align these processes and manage expectations of the different stakeholders is really key. Changing roles, I've alluded to that a little bit. I think there's a real opportunity here for citizens in some of the more advanced participatory governance projects to take on distinctly different roles. It's one thing to open that door, it's another that citizens also have to actually take up that opportunity. And of course, there are major changes involved here in the ways in which local authorities take decisions, engage with the public, engage with scientific evidence, as I've tried to sketch out. So I think finally, just to really stress, it's really important that as we want to mobilize people's knowledge into decision-making processes, we really need to pay attention to the process. It really requires a careful approach, and we do the same when we practice science, let's say traditional science, and we do the same when we are busy in the policy cycle. So on that note, I'd like to thank you for your attention. I very much look forward to the further interactions and discussions.